World War II, the 492nd Bomb Group of the 8th Air Force and the OSS Packing Station under the direction of Schaeff worked in close cooperation with similar British services to deliver thousands of tons of vital supplies to enemy-occupied countries, successfully arming, controlling, and coordinating the activities of 350,000 resistance members. The 492nd Bomb Group alone flew over 3,000 sorties, carrying more than 7,000 tons of operational supplies, which were used by guerrilla forces to blow up German supply trains, depots, and other military strongpoints. Back in London, unknown to most Americans and Britons, was a handful of people who, working in secrecy, were responsible for the success of these missions. Known as the Carpetbagger Group, they operated from an isolated airdrome at Harrington, where a fleet of B-24s took to the air about 15 nights a month, delivering their cargo of supplies and humans only during the moon period. The packing and storage station for Operation Carpetbagger was at home, about 50 miles from Harrington. Blended into the English countryside, well camouflaged from the air, home was inaccessible to railroad facilities. The logistical problem of getting the cargo to the packing station was solved by rerouting the supplies to a nearby railroad station from where they were taken to home by trucks. 10 officers and 350 enlisted men worked long hours at the railroad station and at home, loading and unloading thousands of rounds of ammunition every day. It was monotonous, hard work, but important work, vital to the men in Europe who needed weapons to throw off their oppressors. According to the daily messages from the underground centers, the daily packing orders were worked out in London and brought by a courier to home, increasing in volume as the guerrilla forces on the continent increased in numbers. Occasionally, the daily packing schedule at home consisted of more than 400 items to go to prearranged reception places on the continent. The heaviest demand of the clandestine resistance personnel was for bazookas, carbines, Stens, Bren guns and small arms, 303 rifles, grenades, and other items especially designed for sabotage. Trained research personnel had designed special types of containers weighing 300 to 320 pounds when fully packed, with shock-absorbing buffer at one end. The H container, consisting of 5 interchangeable metal cells, was used for standard items. However, each of these 5 cells could be loaded with different material and carry a variety of items. Very often, one of the cells was packed with 400 to 500 rounds of 303 ammunition, carefully wrapped in burlap bags to keep them from slipping. While the next cell contained boots, socks, gloves, and other clothing material carefully selected to fit the 1944 style in France. Other containers, similarly divided, were used to carry gasoline in jerry cans. Longer items like Brens and other guns were placed in the hollow, one-piece shells of C containers. Every inch of space had to be utilized. Wrapped in burlap bags, the guns were kept in an even position during the flight. Clothing and other items were usually placed around them, with instructions in French on top. Once the clasps were fastened, it was only a matter of days until the guns were in the hands of the Maquis. In another section at home, other material which could not be packed in containers was processed in a different way. Explosives, for instance, had to be handled very carefully. Radio sets, often the only means of communication between London and the underground, were packed in special panniers. These panniers, wire boxes covered with canvas, were stuffed with moisture-resistant Coran fiber, corrugated paper, and hairlock to make them withstand the impact of the drop from the air. Medical supplies, blood plasma, and other breakable items had to be placed in small baskets and tin boxes that were put inside these panniers. A separate cutting and sewing section was working day and night to provide the harnesses necessary to attach parachutes to these panniers and packages. The parachute section provided the chutes, getting the supply requirements of the day ready for shipment. In the course of its operation, Home sent close to 75,000 cargo chutes and a number of personnel chutes on their way to the continent. Then the cargo was taken to the airfield. Meanwhile, at about 11 o'clock each morning, Special Forces headquarters in London had their daily list of targets ready, based on the request of the various underground agents in the field, and phoned them into Harrington. As soon as the phone call came, S2 at Harrington forwarded the list of targets offered by London headquarters to the ops room. The officer in charge marked them on a situation map. Each target was known by the code name of the agent and a number indicating the number of airdrops that had previously been made to that target. A copy of the list was immediately sent to the weather room, where detailed maps of the target area were worked out and brought up to date. Now came the most important moment of the day, the selection of the targets by the commanding officer of Harrington and his staff. Priorities of certain targets, depending on the mission of the individual agent, the number of available aircraft, weather, and flak conditions, all these factors had to be weighed carefully before the decision was made as to which targets would be visited that night. Once the decision was made, the machinery at Harrington swung into gear. S2 notified Special Forces headquarters which targets had been selected. Another call to London informed 8th Air Force headquarters of the proposed route the Carpetbagger planes would take, giving their exact takeoff time and asking for radar clearance for the ships. Then the loading of the planes began. As a rule, 40 to 50 ships were taking off each night. Loading orders were made out specifying the load each plane was going to carry in accordance with the needs of the resistance group to which it was going. Following the loading orders, the ordnance crews started picking up the cargo. C and H containers carrying the weapons of the free world to occupied Europe were loaded onto carriers. Then parachutes were picked up, which were attached to the bucket end of the containers prior to takeoff. From different storage places, panniers containing baskets and tin boxes with sensitive supplies were assembled, along with other miscellaneous items such as tires and bicycles. The supplies were then taken to the planes for loading. The bomb bay of each B-24 had been modified to carry 12 fully packed 300-pound containers that were stored inside the plane like bombs. The same push-button method used to release bombs was employed to drop these containers over France. Panniers and packages were stored forward in the aircraft until after the takeoff. Later, they were placed on small roller conveyors leading to a joe hole cut in the bottom of the fuselage. Static lines were attached to strong points, and upon a signal from the bombardier, the packages went out through the joe hole. While supplies were being loaded into the aircraft, the pilots, navigators, and bombardiers who were going out that night assembled in the briefing room. After a brief introduction by the executive officer, S2 outlined the mission, informing the crew of the flak situation over the target area. Approximately 40 to 50 targets were visited each night without fighter protection. Often there was some human cargo that had to be taken along, agents who had to be dropped on an urgent mission on the continent. Weather and atmospheric conditions were taken up next. Ceiling, visibility, wind velocity, and density. Then the chief navigator outlined the general course on the map, pointing out certain landmarks the pilots were going to hit on their way to the targets. Finally, the pilot of each ship was given his target and, together with his navigator, started working on the flight plans, plotting his individual course. It was usually around 2200 hours when ships and crews were getting ready for the takeoff. In France, the men of the resistance were already starting on their way to the clandestine reception fields, eagerly waiting for the supplies that would come that night. Once more, the position of containers and panniers were checked to make sure they would arrive in good order. The Jeds who were going to be dropped along with the cargo that night arrived on the field, slipping aboard through the joe hole. Then the operations officer gave orders to flight control to signal the planes for the takeoff. Piercing the darkness at Harrington, blinking on and off, the light signals conveyed the orders to the pilots in silence. The first plane roared defiantly toward occupied Europe. The second. The third, until all planes were in the air. At the ops room, the liaison officer reported to 8th Air Force Headquarters, the ships were airborne. Another Carpetbagger mission was on its way.